Hi guys, today in my picture presentation, I will be going over the history of Sunset Cafe and the importance of preserving one's history. Now to start it off, the Sunset Cafe, or Grand Terrace Cafe, was a jazz venue that was built in 1921. Soon after it was built, it became one of Chicago's biggest jazz venues. This was not just some jazz venue, but rather one of the most popular and loved places in Bronzeville, Chicago. During the jazz era, everybody had heard about the legendary Sunset Cafe. It hosted some of the most famous music producers and singers at that time. It was truly a place that the African American community was proud of and held close to their hearts. For years, it was a place where people from all around America and even the world visited and came together to experience it. For a good 30 years, the Sunset Cafe had hosted many new inspiring musicians who later reached fame and gave irreplaceable memories to the people who went to the venue. As years passed, the jazz venue everyone knew and loved, one of Bronzeville's most popular destinations, turned into a hardware store. Why would such a place be turned into a simple hardware store? In the short term, it could be a nice thing to receive money for the property, but what would the people of Bronzeville and everyone else think of this? In the long term, the future generations won't be able to see what their parents grew up around. All the experiences people had in this world-renowned jazz venue were just left to be memories. The owner of Sunset Cafe, uh, who was Joe Glaser, he was Louis Armstrong's manager. Joe Glaser was a car mechanic who later in his life became a businessman, owning a number of nightclubs and also managing prize fights. In this picture you see here, Joe Glaser is the man all the way to the left, and the famous musician Louis Armstrong is the man in the middle. Now, continuing on with the history of Sunset Cafe, the artists that the nightclub hosted and even made were some of the greats, like as I said, Louis Armstrong and even Earl Hines. This is where aspiring musicians had gigs and had their big breaks in becoming famous. Now, the nightclub didn't just house all of these great musicians and people, but it represented the vibrance of the African American community. It clearly depicted the African American way of music and it inspired artists for generations. The preservance of these historical landmarks is important, not just for the sake of people still having a good time, but for one's culture and remembering where they came from. The Sunset Cafe could have remained a world-renowned club, and the older generations from Bronzeville could have had their kids experience this amazing place. There was no need for Sunset Cafe to be left behind in history. This didn't happen to just Sunset Cafe, but many other places that African Americans cherished. Without having such important landmarks, this hurts the culture of people and the future generations who want to know more about themselves. Culture is a big part of who we are as people. The history we leave behind should stay there so we can look back and reminisce about the past. America has kept their historical monuments and landmarks, but the African American community fell short in this regard. Completely forgetting about one's history is a really sad thought. What would the world be if there were no historical landmarks to visit and gaze upon? Preserving Sunset Cafe was important for many reasons. Parents would want their kids to experience the same thing they experienced when they were young. Without historical landmarks such as Sunset Cafe and many others, what can the people of Bronzeville and African Americans look back to? Especially for the people in Bronzeville, this wasn't just some random club, but rather a place they were proud to call their own. Sharing the importance of preserving one's history will have a significant impact on people, and hopefully will further enlighten them to do so. People aren't aware how important preserving one's history is, and they won't know until it's gone. Thank you for listening.